Monica, quando vuoi possiamo andare online. Hello everybody, thank you for being here. Thanks for all the people who are attending in presence here in the University Guglielmo Marconi and for the people who are connected online. So today we are going to listen to the second part of the first lesson of the cycle of lessons by Professor William Croft. The title of the lesson we are listening today is Lineage-based linguistics and an evolutionary framework for language. As you probably already know, yesterday we had the first part of the lesson, and today we are going to listen to the second part of the lesson. Please, Bill.
Thank you very much, Luca. So, as Luca just told you, this is the second part of the lesson. The first part I described this evolutionary framework for language and gave essentially the overview. This part is going to be focused on one particular phenomenon, and I should also mention that the first half of the lesson I was able to get a little farther than I expected, but also for technical reasons I just had to create a PDF of my slides. So I may end up skipping some slides just because of time, because I basically unskipped everything just in case I could actually get to it all. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm afraid there's a lot of detail, but I want to emphasize that the main thing that's here that would sound new to some linguists is that instead of thinking of various kinds of linguistic concepts as having what is the philosophers call an essential definition, instead we think of them all as historical entities. And that includes things like a speech community, which most people probably do at least informally think of as a historical entity. It arose at some time in the history of humankind and existed for a while and then broke up or went extinct, at least as a speech community. Also a language, well, there's a difference of view. Most historical linguists, sociolinguists, usage-based linguists think of a language as an actual, the corpus or the totality of utterances that the speech community produces. Other people think of a language as a more abstract system, and that's what I'm basically arguing against, or at least providing an alternative view. And then likewise, we think of, this is where it gets more controversial, I think, is because we think of grammatical categories or constructions like the English progressive construction as not being defined by a certain set of structural properties, but it's also a historical entity that arose in the history of English, is currently widely used, and may disappear in the future history of English. I won't be focusing on things like grammatical categories. I'm going to go back to speech communities and languages. Now, when I say historical entity, it's not just an arbitrary collection of human beings for a speech community, or an arbitrary collection of utterances that they've produced. The utterances belong together, the speech community belongs together because they interact with each other, and you can construct lineages, at least in theory, of the usage of, say, a particular word or a particular construction. And, most historical linguists focusing on the classical view, we think about languages splitting up. A proto-language splits up into its daughter languages and it comes to an end as a result. And then those daughter languages can split into dialects that become separate languages in the future. And I specifically defined a speech community as a community of people who, communicatively interact with each other. And so it's conversation, obviously. But I also said they are communicatively isolated. That is part of what makes them you speakers of Italian and me not a speaker of Italian, besides the fact that I barely know hardly any words of Italian, is that I don't interact with you in Italian and vice versa. I mean, we interact in English instead. But we all know that people actually aren't communicatively isolated, even in the communities thousands of years ago in, places where the transportation wasn't like it is today. People still interacted with other people that were members of other speech communities. And then the languages came into contact. Well, this actually is a very well-known phenomenon in biology. People don't usually think of it that way because most of the time, people who are not biologists, when they think of biology, they think of animals. And you don't get like, giraffes interbreeding with elephants, for example. However, if you are a botanist, in the plant world, hybridization is rampant, and most botanists accept that if you're going to try to construct a family tree, they call it a phylogeny of particular group of plants, there's going to be a lot of what they call reticulation, where what were once separate species hybridize, and then a new species may arise as a result of that hybridization process. So again, although what I've described here is quite similar to biology, in this case, it is still similar to biology. And so they have phenomenon, and so I've borrowed some of their terminology just to kind of ram home the point that there is this parallel, because as I said yesterday, both language and evolution biological evolution are describing change by replication. We replicate words, sounds, and utterances, and then of course in biology they replicate organisms in reproduction. Okay, so when I say reticulation in language lineages, the title of today's talk basically, it's basically about language contact, and more particularly about contact languages. So trying to discuss what different contact languages are, and what is the social function of such languages. Okay, so now we can move on. I want to focus particularly on lineages, which was the topic I ended with yesterday. So replicators, so those are things like sounds, words, and constructions in language, they form lineages. The lineages are defined by people choosing to replicate those from their knowledge of language. Populations, that's the technical term biologists use for these historical entities, form lineages to the extent that the lineages of the members of the population are interwoven. So I'm part of a speech community because I talk to a bunch of other English speakers in New Mexico, or in other social contexts that like my family, for instance, and friends. So they're interwoven because all of us are talking to each other at different times. Isolation of populations, the point I was just talking about, the absence of interaction, is often incomplete. So that's what I want to focus on here. Mention that in biology, they're familiar with this too, because it happens especially in plants. And populations may merge, leading to reticulation of the population lineage. So I don't have my nice animation where this would all be just scrolling down the screen, showing you a bunch of replications. Those little L's are about linguimes, which is the term that I coined to describe occurrences of sounds, words, and constructions and utterances, that is, pieces of linguistic structures. So you have an initial community at the top, and then when it splits, then you have separate lineages that don't cross over. And that's what we think of as the community splitting and then evolving into two separate languages. But incomplete isolation and reticulation is found in languages. This is the result of language contact, as I said in my introduction. Languages as populations are ultimately defined in terms of the speech communities that produce or reproduce those language forms and utterances. So in other words, we must try to identify the social causes of the linguistic results of language contact. And the best way to do this is by a barely emerging field called sociolinguistic typology. field that hardly exists at present, and I originally wrote this. This is based on some work I did actually quite a while ago, after I wrote Explaining Language Change. But the person who uses this term is Peter Trudgill, and I'll mention his work soon, maybe not very soon, but soon. So reticulation is when two populations actually merge. So they were once separate, they come together, and they produce a hybrid population. So, as I said, two plants that hybrid, groups of plants, or two plant species that hybridize. Biologists use the term introgression, which is the case where two particular individuals, parts of these two different species, hybridize. And then the offspring back cross. This is another plant or breeding term in English. So they hybridize. That's what goes from A to B, and then that hybrid back crosses, namely it mates or sexual reproduction with someone from the original community, the yellow community there. And then you get another mixture of this, and then it continues to back cross into that community. And so you get to stage D, where it looks like it's basically part of that yellow species population. But there's a few genes that it got from the blue species. And that looks a lot like borrowing. I mean, borrowing has to happen when there is at least one speaker who knows at least something about both of the languages, and then interacts with members of that other speech community and produces an utterance which will probably have a mixture of linguemes from, pronunciate, me giving an English pronunciation to an Italian word. That would be a good example. And then, maybe there'd be some effect of that. I mean, obviously it's not going to happen with me in Italian, but some people have argued that all of the immigration that happened in United States cities of the Northeast, like Detroit, Buffalo, New York, Boston, and so on, all the immigration of people from Eastern and Southern Europe into the urban centers has led to those distinctive accents that you find in those cities. And if you go outside the cities into, say what they call upstate New York, which happens to be where my grandparents lived, then, they don't speak like people in New York City. So we have examples here from the American Southwest, where there's been a lot of work on what's called code switching. So in this case, you have like whole words just mixed together. Okay, don't forget, llámame después. But then you can get something a little more integrated. So he was training to fight, and there it's just estaba training para pelear, and then the other one is you actually inflect the English word train for the future, ya lo no treñará. And then you get a word that I guess normally inflects, at least in the borderland Spanish that's spoken actually in, not far from where I currently live in New Mexico. So I'm finally going to quit is yo voy a quitear ya, and just looks like Spanish, but it's an English word. Lots of examples of that. This just shows how the process began. Okay, so what you have there, you can see there's a little dotted line across there where a lingueme from the community on the right after the split gets replicated by members of the community on the left, and then if that continues to be replicated, then it's a borrowed form, borrowed pronunciation, borrowed word, even a borrowed construction. Okay, so in my 2000 book, I make a distinction which finally seems to be made a little more frequently in people who work on borrowing and not in this framework, and I can't remember the terms that are sometimes now used, but the ones I came up with in the book were substance lingueme. So this is a borrowing or a pairing of form and meaning. So a grammatical morpheme is not just the notion of past tense or the notion of first person object, it's the actual form, the English ed and the English me. There's basic vocabulary and non-basic vocabulary. And then schematic linguimes, it's only form or only meaning. So it's not the pairing of form and meaning or sound and meaning. So only form would be the way a phoneme is phonetically realized. We'll think of the different pronunciations of the orthographic R in the languages of Western Europe. It's an example that Treadgill uses. Or only meaning, constructional schema, so using the have verb, the possession, have type possession verb with a participial form of the verb, and using that to mean perfect. So in other words, what historical linguists would call a calque, at least in English. Polysyny for pattern, so using the same verb to describe knowing a person and knowing a fact. And in English, it is one and the same verb, but imagine if, I don't know what the story is. In Italian and Spanish, they're two different verbs. I think in Italian, you have conoscere, capere, sapere, yeah. So cognates with Spanish. So imagine if there's an Italian or like a Spanish dialect in the southwest of the US where they use, something like saber, they use it for both knowing a person as well as knowing a fact. And it's basically because English has one verb for that purpose. Okay, so when some linguists, the traditional term has been structural borrowing. It actually conflates borrowing the form as well as the meaning, say of a perfect marker, or it conflates that with schematic linguimes, or just, the notion of forming a perfect in a certain way, like with a have verb. But it turns out that schematic linguimes are much more easily borrowed than substance grammatical linguimes. I was drawn to this because of the debate about what kinds of, quote, grammatical morphemes, unquote, are borrowed in languages and how easily. And there's a big difference between, a schematic pattern, developing a tense system or grammatical number using the resources, the formal structures of your language, as opposed to actually borrowing the tense suffix of Spanish or the plural suffixes of the tense suffixes of Spanish or the plural suffixes of Spanish into a language. So it would be nice to have there are borrowing hierarchies, and then they get kind of muddled, I think, by conflating substance and schematic linguimes. What would be more interesting would be a theory of social factors that motivate certain types of borrowing, or using the biological term, introgression of linguimes. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So here's an example of a study that was made by a bunch of non-linguists, and I've interacted with people, mostly biologists who have been using linguistic data, and let's just say it varies in convincingness to a linguist. But this is a case where I think it's a fairly specific claim, but it was done well, I think, and that is people looking at when the rate of vocabulary change, and the argument is that when as we all know, in the history of human languages, there's a period where for whatever social reason, there's a massive spread and then breakup of a language into its daughters. Latin and Romance is a good example. And the question is there greater change, the rate of vocabulary change greater when that happens than in a less dramatic situation where you get, only very gradual splitting. And that's what they found in this particular paper. And the terminology here is, again, from biology. Stephen Jay Gould, a well-known evolutionary biologist, developed this notion of punctuated equilibrium, saying that for eons, species don't change, and then something happens, and then there's quick change. A lot of extinction, a lot of new species created, speciation, and those are the punctuated periods. And so to the extent that you have these singular dramatic events, social demographic events, then you also get an increase in vocabulary change. And Bantu, Indo-European, Austronesian, I can't remember what P and S, which families there are. Oh, Polynesian, well, that's a subgroup of Austronesian. And then the biological species pattern is the S at the end. Okay, so in a paper of mine, actually didn't get out until 2021. I had described what we're going to see as 3 language types. The first 2 are taken from a paper first written about Melanesia, cited at the bottom. And the terminology that Thurston came up with was describing a language in terms of its social function. So an esoteric language is one that is used for communication within a speech community. Contrasted to an exoteric language, which is one used for communication between members of different speech communities that remain distinct. So essentially a language for internal communication and interaction within the speech community versus a language which is used also, or maybe, and as we'll see, exclusively for external communication between 2 different groups. So a language may be both esoteric and exoteric at the same time, and a language may change its social type over time, for instance, developing exoteric functions, or could develop esoteric functions or become restricted to esoteric functions. So you really have to ask, who are you using this language with? People of your own community or people from other communities? This is my overview. So that's a type. Those terms have been picked up and used in sociolinguistic research. People work on language contact for quite a while. That paper's pretty old now. But then there's another type we really need to have, as I found when I started surveying contact languages. A language that's used when speech communities merge. That is, between members of formerly distinct speech communities that are now a single community. So this reticulation effect, where once they were separate communities, and now they are one. There's no general term for the social language type. It essentially represents one way in which an exoteric language becomes esoteric, used internally. It's basically because the external boundaries are erased. And the term I coined for these is neogenic languages, newly created. This is all very abstract at this point, but I will now start laying out this as a way of typologizing contact languages socially. Now, there are some proposals out there. Again, Peter Trudgill is well known for this, so I see the citation there. His book was actually titled Sociolinguistic Typology from 2011. And he argued, and he's not the first to argue this actually, Henning Anderson made a similar argument, well before Trudgill, that esoteric languages tend towards greater complexity, exoteric ones towards simplification. The claim being that esoteric languages are usually spoken in a relatively small community and everybody knows everybody else, and they basically have all sorts of complexity that is maintained. Exoteric ones, you're speaking with other people who are not native speakers of your language, so there's a lot of second language learning, and that leads to the simplification. That's the hypothesis, and then the hypothesized explanation. So Trudgill proposes 5 social determinants of simplification, complexification. So degree of isolation would make it more complex. Degree of social stability, more stable is more complex, less stable, simpler. Community size, smaller leads to more complex languages. Larger, less face-to-face interaction. Social network density, so a dense social network would be more complex. And then the amount of communal common ground, this is something that I talked about yesterday, is a social prerequisite for understanding how language is used, how much shared knowledge you have about everything in the world around you. Now, these proposals have not been really rigorously examined cross-linguistically. One example is there is a paper, again, by a couple of people who aren't linguists, and they used data from the World Atlas of Language Structures to look at basically morphological complexity. So they looked at the morphological categories that are represented in chapters and walls, and then did the math and showed that it correlated with population size. And then, of course, numerous issues surround the definition of linguistic structure, complexity, and simplicity. Lots has been written about that. So that's why you could, I mean, even morphological complexity is defined by just the number of morphemes in a morphological category defined by the author of the Walls chapter. So let's be quite precise about how, specific this argument is. It's not a general support for something like Tugill's theory. So, of course, pidgins and creoles come along. And what I'm going to do now in this section, and a big chunk of this talk, is to essentially discuss Salikoko Mufwene's theory about the relationship between pidgins and creoles. This is not, I don't know if I would say it's, not widely accepted among creolists, or whether it's certainly one of several views. So the standard view is that pidgins are simplified languages with linguimes that come from multiple source languages, and they're used as exoteric languages. They're used for inter-community contact or conversation. Creoles, on the other hand, are pidgins that have acquired native speakers, whatever that means, and are therefore used as an esoteric language for a speech community, is the normal way that people within the speech community interact with each other. So there's certain problems with the standard view. These maps are actually from Mufwene. First thing he points out is that the locations or origins of creoles and pidgins actually take place in different parts of the world. So it's not like a creole is, one of those little red dots is like enclosed within a blue dot. There's one interesting exception to this, which I'll come back to later in the talk. So Mufwene's theory is that pidgins emerge from trade colonization. That is a language that's used solely for exoteric function. Europeans traveling the world from the 16th century onwards interacted with the indigenous populations using basically creating a pidgin that was used for that interaction. And he argues instead that creoles emerged from what's called plantation colonization or settler colonization, and it's the terms used in sociology. It's the establishment of a new speech community formed from parts of many speech communities. So he points out that when you look at Creole languages, you can see the parts of their grammar are sourced from non-standard European language speakers, so not, London English or Metropolitan or French, Parisian French, from speakers of minor European languages, so indigenous languages of Europe, who were recruited onto these ships and sent overseas. So speakers of Gaelic, like Irish and Scots Gaelic and Breton. And then slaves from Africa and the Americas who were speaking their own indigenous languages. He argues that the historical linguistic properties of a pidgin or a creole is the result of social competition between linguimes in the, quote, linguistic feature pool. That's what he called it. It's what I called the linguime pool yesterday. So when I said there are I said we can typologize languages by their social function into these three categories, but these three categories are not uniform themselves. Each of them forms a continuum of language types that that you'll soon recognize. So pidgins actually represent one extreme of the exoteric language continuum, languages that are used for inter-community contact. The other end of the continuum are lingua francas, like English is now. That's why we're all speaking in English. And, I've been to many conferences in Europe where there were no English speakers around, except me sitting quietly. And, everyone else was speaking English, even though they were Belgian, Dutch, German, French, you name it. Then there's what you can call asymmetric bilingualism, and that is the asymmetric use of one esoteric language for exoteric use. So you could probably safely say that Italian is used more, at a global level, is used more for communication among Italians, whereas English is used both for communication in the English speech community, but also. So in other words, this lingua franca, or maybe even not a lingua franca being used widely, but maybe just neighboring communities in Africa, say, they don't equally speak each other's language. One of them is always the one that's used for inter-community communication. And then you have bilingualism, multilingualism. So that's symmetric, where people in speech communities, neighboring speech communities, each of them learn the other language to some degree, enough to engage in kind of conversations that take place between the communities. And then you have the form of, then you have dual lingualism, where I remember seeing this in a restaurant in London once, where I think it was, I don't know whether there's Italians and a Spanish waitress or vice versa, but they each just spoke their own language. They were close enough. They understood each other. You know, they got their order, and she got the bill. Now, there's a sociolinguistic puzzle I encountered when I was doing this research, surveying these contact languages. These are long quotes, so I won't read them all because time is actually moving on. Which is that there are parts of the world which are linguistically very diverse. If you saw a language map of Papua New Guinea, this is like infamous as being a place, a fairly large island, but it still has 700 languages that are quite diverse in their genetic origins and so on. And it says the number of reported pigeons is surprisingly small in that area. Likewise, interior of Canada, you know, indigenous languages of the Americas are also very numerous compared to, say, European languages. So, you know, no pigeons are recorded from the entire interior of Canada. And in Brazil, you know, South America is probably even more linguistically diverse than North America. And so it's an area of extraordinary ethnic and linguistic diversity, yet no lingua franca seems to have developed. And then in American Southwest and also California, those are the areas that have the greatest density of languages, indigenous languages, or did. And no obvious explanation for the apparent scarcity of indigenous contact languages in the Southwest. Well, I think the solution to this puzzle is in social structure. So, then there's a lot of controversy among social anthropologists about the parameters, but I think most of them would generally accept the contrast you see listed on those two starred bullet points at the top, that you can differentiate societies as to whether they're egalitarian or stratified, in fairly technical sense of stratified, and then small scale versus large scale population size. Egalitarian societies where there's no hereditary elite also tend to be small scale. In an earlier classification, which is controversial nowadays, these are categories called bands and tribes. Stratification typically develops when a larger scale, larger population of chiefdoms, still larger scale leads to state societies. So almost all societies engage in intersocietal interaction. There's very, very few that have been claimed to be extremely, isolated, though there are some. But the exoteric language type varies. All of the areas with numerous esoteric languages lacking pigeons or lingua francas are inhabited by small-scale egalitarian societies. So they're just basically a lot of symmetric bilingualism. Lingua francas emerge where there's a larger scale stratified society that engages in long-distance trade. These, of course, are continua themselves. It's a dimension. It's not a dichotomy. And pigeons are found in cases of extreme asymmetry and or minimal interaction and conduct, usually with a large-scale state society as the dominant group. And so now the stable multilingualism will lead to the general maintenance of core substance linguemes, grammatical morphemes, basic vocabulary. So those are form meaning pairings in the respective speech community, although non-basic vocabulary is often borrowed. And then there's people who have claimed that in small-scale societies you can find more extensive borrowing, but a number of linguists, or groups of linguists who have researched this, have argued that first, it's generally not the case that there is that much borrowing. And anyway, you can kind of identify which is the, quote, real parent language, even up to 40% borrowing, because the borrowing is not of the same, spread across the vocabulary. On the other hand, intensive symmetric multilingualism can lead to these schematic linguisms. So there's this infamous case of the town of Kupwar in India by Gumpers back from 1971, where he argued that there are languages, Urdu, Marathi, and Kannada. The last one is Dravidian. The other two are, of course, Indo-Aryan. And the morphemes are different, as you can see by looking at the Kannada line, but the syntactic structure, the schematic construction form, looks just about the same. And there's a couple more examples. More recently, Malcolm Ross, who's looked at contact languages in the oceanic context, has called this Matatapi, or I guess is how you would pronounce that. So the kinds of things we see as lingua francas and pidgins around the world are mostly of European origin. And they're basically exoteric languages that appear to have been introduced by state societies conducting long-distance trade, with the advent of intercontinental colonization and trade in the 16th century. So I did what was at the time a pretty comprehensive survey of well-documented non-European lingua francas and pidgins. It's all based on secondary literature. So for instance, Bernd Heine wrote a very nice book on contact languages in Africa. So here's his map, just an overview of the major contact languages and pidgins and lingua francas in Africa. And then I basically went through and looked at these and looked at what kind of social context there was. And the lingua francas were for various empires or state societies that existed in Africa, of which there were quite a few before the Europeans got in there. Others emerged for trade with European states. So, the internal social organization of African societies changed quite a bit with a greater contact of Europeans in the 16th century and onwards. So there was consolidation of new states, state-level societies in Africa, even though they weren't European colonies. They were just reorganized themselves in order to deal with the European colonizers and the warfare and so on that happened. I think for time, let's see, I guess I can go on. So I had first cut out all the examples from North America just to make it go faster, but there are a number of North American pidgins that are based on indigenous languages, and there's been some dispute, some debate in the contact literature about when these contact languages arose. And it appears, at least I've been persuaded, that most of these are largely post-European contact, or they emerged, like I said, with these African cases where they were, even though it may not be in direct contact with European colonizers, invaders, the indirect contact led to this sort of social reorganization of indigenous societies in North America that basically created the social situations or social contexts for lingua francas to arise. So these are you can see the dates on these various pidgins and based on Native American languages. And it's been argued that these two that are in brown may have predated European contact. But here's basically various authors making the point I just made before, is that there was a greater increase of contact among the indigenous groups, between the indigenous societies, after the Europeans came, because basically the presence of the Europeans as traders led to greater inter-community trade within the indigenous societies of North America. Well, not just North America, but Africa, and Heine makes his comment, and then various states from different parts of the world in the last quote. Another cause of this greater contact between indigenous societies was the diseases decimating many Native American societies. So they fell together. They came together for survival before they had seen a single white man. And then likewise in Africa, as I mentioned before, the trade with the Europeans led to intensification of long-distance trade with the inland societies. And then another one is the sweet potato. It's striking. It made its way to the eastern New Guinea highlands somehow, well, via trade, and it led to the intensification of agriculture, and political changes in the highlands of New Guinea led to greater trade. Also greater expansion of particular language families. If you look at the language families of New Guinea, there's one large family that dominates in the highlands, and probably, I assume it's associated with the sweet potato cultivation. Plain sign language as a pre-European lingua franca. Well, this is a hot topic, politically sensitive topic, actually at my university here. And there's discussion by Alan Taylor, and the sign language was reported by early 16th century explorers in the Gulf Coast area, so that's the area that's off of what you will recognize as, hopefully, as Texas and Louisiana. And then plain sign language spread north and west in European times, so it may have originated before European contact in a local region, but its expansion seems to be associated with European entry into North America. So this is what it says. The societies in the Gulf area were stratified societies. There are a number of parts of North America which had stratified societies before European contact. Likewise in Oceania, I mentioned that there were very few pigeons, but there were some, and they seem to have been associated with the kind of incipient stratified societies in the Sepik River. That's the hatched area. So there's some economic specialization, incipient stratification. This is assuming these really do predate European contact. It's always very difficult to evaluate that. And then, of course, there are the trading languages of the Austronesians who had settled on the coast of Papua New Guinea, but were themselves, of course, ocean-going peoples that spread through all of Oceania before Europeans came along. And then you see the experience of the decline of multilingualism with the emergence of larger-scale stratified societies. And so this is a typical pattern of language change and language shift. You start out with people who are older, in this case male too, and this is in Papua New Guinea, in a village of Papua New Guinea, where the esoteric language, the village language, was called Tayap. There is that lingua franca, which we'll talk about later, Tok Pisin. And then there are neighboring languages spoken in the neighboring villages. So the older people were basically multilingual in the languages of their own village and the neighboring village, and had some knowledge of lingua franca at the point that the survey was made. And then as you get to younger people, progressively younger people, they know less and less of the neighboring languages. So the traditional symmetric bilingualism, is falling away. And then you have teenagers that only know the esoteric language and the lingua franca, and then the kids, they only know the lingua franca. They have very passive knowledge at most of what was originally the community language. And you see these things, kind of things. I see these happening in the Pueblo Indian societies in New Mexico, near where I live. Similar thing that was observed by Bernd Heine. There's a small group of people in west and central Kenya who knew only their mother tongue, and then some few who were multilingual, very few, 0.6%. And then there's some that were quite multilingual. They knew the mother tongue, they knew the local vernaculars, and they learned the lingua franca. It was like the top category in that New Guinea village. But most of them just know their mother tongue and the lingua franca, so like the third row of the third row in this, the teenagers. Now I'm going to shift to neogenic languages. So as I told you that this is an additional category from the ones that were described by Thurston. And again, you have another continuum of kind of degree of distinctness of languages. So the neogenic language, this is a language that emerges from a new community being created by the bringing together, or conquest in many cases, of what were previously separate communities. So of course the most extreme case is language shift, where you get basically one language from one of those communities essentially wipes out the others, and there's little trace of those other communities in the language. The Koine or standard is a subtype of that, which I won't talk about today, where you have the language that's brought together, a hybrid of closely related varieties of the original communities, and you see this in many European standard languages where the standard language may roughly be based on one of the more regional varieties, like I guess Florentine Italian, London English, but it has the standard language as it's codified will have some elements from other regional varieties, but they're so closely related it's not a case of shifting, like say in the British Isles between Celtic languages and the Germanic languages. Then you have what are called partially restructured language. So it's a more substantially modified variety of the dominant community. And then Creoles are an even more modified variety. And finally, you get this category that is kind of quite a variegated category called mixed languages, where you have less asymmetric, I said. So the crucial thing about all those other categories is that they're pretty asymmetric. It's one dominant language that has been influenced to a greater or lesser degree by other languages in this new community. But mixed languages, it's not so obvious, what's the true parent, quote unquote. So this neogenic language continuum, brings us these questions about the mixing of languages, that is the mixing of linguimes, linguistic structures, sounds, words, and constructions that are part of that language. And as I said, this is what Mufwene was very interested in. For the social factors that allow for mixing, the more complex cases are rare, the mixed languages. They typically occur in the state society involved, but there's some degree of social distance between the community that speaks the mixed language and the dominant group. And then the linguistic one is the contributions of the parent languages is generally quite asymmetrical. I guess that's all I have to say. So let's start with language shift. Pretty straightforward. Creation of a state society by conquest or other means of socioeconomic incorporation. It leads at first to a multilingual society. The United States is still a multilingual society. There are many indigenous languages that are still spoken in the United States, for instance. The dominant group's language usually serves as the lingua franca before language shift is complete. So, it's going on in the societies, the indigenous native groups in America, which haven't yet lost their languages. English is used as the lingua franca. It's not like I can go to Zuni Pueblo and they expect me to know some Zuni to speak with them. They'll speak to me in English. But increased economic and political integration of the state usually leads eventually to complete language shift. And we do see that with the indigenous languages in the United States. The increase really happened after World War II when wage labor became the dominant form of employment for Native Americans. You get incomplete shift in Africa, so some African lingua francas emerged when states were formed, either before or after European contact. So you've got these African lingua francas because there were empires created, empires in the sense of a state containing many, many different, speech communities. And then still other lingua francas emerged when states were formed as European colonies. So the process of neogeny was imposed by the European country that took over that part of Africa and then created what are now, states of Africa. There were, of course, large empires in, pre-Columbian North America. So you had languages like Quechua and Nahuatl that served as lingua francas. Lingua Gerais in Brazil emerged as a lingua franca for the Portuguese colony. That's a native lingua franca. What are some of the linguistic effects? This is where you get this schematic linguings coming in. So Irish English that Peter Trudgill talks about, these are all expressions that sound odd to me, like this is belonging to me. The use of after for perfect, I'm after seeing him, for I have seen him. Wider use of the cleft construction than, let's say, a British English or American English speaker would use. Use of elliptical verb phrases instead of yes or no is one of the possible types of responses to polarity questions. So these are things that are characteristic of Irish English. So they're speaking English, but they're using construction schemas that were taken from Irish Gaelic. So now we get to the interesting question of Tok Pisin. This is seems to be, the people who are critics of Mufweni's theory to put this example up as a counterexample to his theory. So what really happened here with Tok Pisin? So basically, it started out as an exoteric trade language in Oceania, in the area around the island of New Guinea. Then it became creolized in Papua New Guinea, and that had become a colony. The eastern half of the island was a colony. And so it became essentially the state language, especially when Papua New Guinea became an independent state. Tok Pisin became the lingua franca, the language that unified the new state of Papua New Guinea. And then you saw, I already gave you the example from that village of Tayap giving way to Tok Pisin. So it just became the lingua franca of the new state. So if you bring in neogeny, as opposed to just exoteric and esoteric languages, then you have an explanation about how a pidgin could become a Creole. It's because of this neogenic process, the creation of a new state. So restructured varieties, an interesting survey by John Holm of partial structuring of vernaculars. And he studied 5 of these partly structured varieties. Thank you very much. So they've undergone some degree of simplification in the usual sense. And John Holm's study concluded that the most significant factor leading to restructuring was the ratio of non-native to native speakers. So the more non-native speakers, the more restructuring took place. So that part of Trudgill's hypothesis seems to be, so it's clearly supported by this study, this empirical study. So Mufweni, sort of not satisfied with annoying all the pidginists and creolists in his own field, argued that the difference between restructured varieties and creoles is a matter of degree and not kind. Both a new society is created. So the idea, I called it neogeny, but I have to, give full credit to Sally Coco Mufweni for making this idea an important part of his analysis of the emergence of creoles. Of course, in creoles, the ratio of non-native speakers is even higher than in the restructured varieties that John Holman studied, including non-native European speakers. People weren't native speakers of English or French, like Gaelic, Breton, and non-standard varieties of these European languages, as well as African slaves. And so he argues, and this is the interesting part, is that many of the things that we thought of as Creole linguistic features of these European-based Creoles are actually structures, schematic linguimes coming from non-standard varieties of English or French or Spanish accelerated grammaticalization processes as well. So not all of it, just because they don't look like standard in English and French, then they may never have looked like standard in English and French, because the English and French speakers were either like Celtic speakers who were second language speakers of English and French, or provincial speakers of provincial dialects of French and English. And this is where I said not only did he annoy the Pidginists and Creolists, then he went after the traditional historical linguists and pointed out that the difference between much, quote, normal language transmission in Creoles is a matter of degree. So looking at the colonial expansion, as he called it, just to make people notice. The colonial expansion of Proto-Indo-European across the European continent is what is pictured there. And of course, there were incorporation of non-native speakers and degrees of restructuring and the diversification of Indo-European. Traditional historical linguists call substrates, Celtic and Romance and in English, and of Ugrian, Finno-Ugric groupings in Eastern Europe, in Scandinavian and Eastern European languages. So he argues that Creoles are descendants of the languages that provide the vast majority of their core substance linguemes. So in other words, Haitian Creole French is a descendant of French. This is the thing that Creolists are remarkably resistant about. I mean, to me as a non-Creolist, this seems to make a lot of sense, I have to confess. But it's controversial among Pidginists and Creolists. Now, mixed languages. I do have time to cover this. So we talk about normal language transmission. I put it in quotes because it often involves some kind of integration of, quote, non-native speakers. Restructuring and creolization, they all involve a clearly dominant contribution of linguists from a single population lineage. In most cases, it's a European language, the kinds that have been feature in a lot of the discussion. And as I said, Mufwene has kind of broadened that to include, quote, European language-based Creoles. So he takes a broader view than, say, some other Creolists and some traditional historical linguists. But, everybody balks or doesn't know what to do with a small number of languages that are described as mixed languages. Such languages are very rare. Since I did my survey, it seems, there have been people who proposed more and more mixed languages out there. And it's hard to evaluate just, quote, how mixed are they? Because you have to have a pretty symmetric or at least unusual contribution of linguemes from usually two parent languages to get something that most linguists would call a mixed language. And some of them aren't very well documented. So, they'll say, oh, the basic vocabulary came from language X, but the, quote, grammar, unquote, comes from language Y that's unrelated to X. And it's like, well, you need more detail to find out exactly how this combination happens. So what I'm going to describe to you here is, it's actually, a lot of it is in the book, I guess. I think it's in the book. Anyway, of some well-documented mixed languages that were particularly prominent in discussions in like the 1990s and the aughts, the 2000s. And so I argued in that you could describe three different types based on their social context of use. So I gave a name, death by borrowing. So this is a community that is surrounded by a dominant community, but is, informally, in ethnographic descriptions, is characterized as really maintaining its own identity and resisting, socially resisting the dominant group in the face of intense pressure. So there's this language, Ma'a, where you've got, you can see you have classifiers from Swahili, and I think the content words are from a Cushitic language. So not only is non-basic vocabulary borrowed, but even basic vocabulary and some substance grammatical morphemes are borrowed as well. And examples include Asia Minor Greek before World War I and the expulsion of the Greeks from what is now Turkey. Kormakiti Arabic, which are Maronite Christians that were in Cyprus who spoke Arabic. Ma'a, this East African language I just described, and then some varieties of Romani. So Yaron Matras, who was formerly my colleague, we were both at Manchester for a while, argues that in Para-Romani, the Romani variety that's spoken in Britain, there's been what he called functional turnover. The language survives only as a hypo-esoteric secret language consisting of the dominant language with some basic vocabulary inserted, kind of enough that an English speaker overhearing this conversation would not really know what's going on. That's the whole point of a secret language. And I'll talk about secret languages in a few minutes. Well, like as in right now. So these are cases where, as I said, these are societies that were resisting outside pressure to assimilate. And so the linguistic form of this resistance is an esoteric language, a language that not only is only used within the speech community, but you don't even want anybody else outside the community to understand this. So the example that we just gave with this Para-Romani was one of a secret language. It's a language with limited domains of use, but deliberately designed to exclude overhearers. It may include vocabulary from other secret languages. Yaron Matras had done research on other secret languages in Western Europe. And it may be formed by language games. So you found that some of these secret languages had, vocabulary from various non-European languages, enough in there to make them essentially secret from the general populace. Or they could be created by language games like Verlan and Cockney rhyming slang. It said anything but the public language. So, that would be essentially mangling the words of the public language so that the outer society members couldn't understand that. Then you have these exclusive esoteric languages, a language in general use in a speech community, but exoteric use is discouraged or avoided, such as the Pueblo languages in New Mexico. And I have an anecdote from a student of mine who was from one of these Pueblos, and I asked him about, well, how, because if you go to New Mexico, you'll say, oh, there's 19 Pueblos, that's what they say everywhere. But they speak a lot of different languages, and the languages are not closely related. Some of them are, but some of them are quite unrelated. And so even within a relatively small geographical area, there's a lot of languages. And I asked him, well, in your Pueblo, how is communication between Pueblos done before the Europeans came along, and before Spanish and then English became a lingua franca? And he said, well, in each community, there were certain people who are like designated interpreters, people who learned the language of the neighboring Pueblos that spoke a different language. So in other words, they were pretty esoteric. They really didn't want, probably neither Pueblo wanted a lot of the members of the other Pueblo to learn their language. So they channeled communication through a small subset of the community. And then you have non-exclusive esoteric languages. So that would be an esoteric language's exoteric use is not discouraged or avoided. So again, in my personal experience in the American Southwest, so the Diné language, the Navajo language, they don't seem to be so bothered with, say, an English speaker like a linguist in the Southwest, or just someone who interacts for other reasons with Navajo community. They don't seem to be so bothered that that person might learn some Navajo. It's an extremely difficult language to learn, but it's not like, the vibe is very different from the vibe with the Pueblo communities. So continuing with these three social types of mixed languages, now that you've seen the sort of kinds of esoteric languages, so I have what I described as semi-shift. the speakers shifts partway to the dominant language. And the one language that I could find that was well documented of this was the media lengua in Ecuador, where Quechua and Spanish are the contributors. And it is kind of like they shifted halfway. Again, content words, but including function words. But now you have Quechua affixes. So kind of the mirror image of what we saw with Ma'a, the language of East Africa that we looked at before. But it seems like the social situation is, again, an indigenous society that's being overwhelmed by the colonial dominant society and is just meeting them halfway, so to speak. And then the third type I described, I called them mixed marriage languages. So these were cases where men and women come from different speech communities. So this fact is well documented. So there's Medny Aleut. So this is an island between Alaska and the Russian Far East. Back in the early 19th century or late 18th century, Russian sealers, who became some 10% of the population, married Aleut women. They were mutually bilingual at first. And then there was this temporary absence of Russian influence. So there was this withdrawal of Russian influence, just for large-scale political reasons. And therefore, they were an isolated community. But there wasn't like Russian pressuring the rest of the Aleuts to shift to Russian. So then you get a language where you have contributions from both Russian and Aleut, but they're much more, I wouldn't say like totally symmetric, but it's much more equal contribution than, say, a Creole language. The other best well-known case of this is Michif. These are French trappers in Canada who are married to Cree women, so they native women. Again, multilingual, and now the loss of the French, kind of overbearing French social and linguistic pressure was because Canada basically became English with the exception of Quebec and some of the Eastern territories. And so in the plains, the Canadian plains, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, that area, Cree, that was indigenously Cree, you had these people who spoke French, or their parents spoke French, grandparents, but there was no other French influence other than this family influence. And so you get, and English couldn't fit at all because it doesn't look like Cree and it doesn't look like French. So then you get this kind of construction theory of this kind of mixture. And I would imagine, again, I don't have too much witness of this, but that given that it's kind of like an internal family language, that you probably get some sort of mixed language going on like this, that in the transition between immigrants in European immigrants 100 years ago, before America shut off immigration, one of its previous times in 1924. And I do recall listening to my grandmother, who was Ukrainian and came before that and had lived in America for about 60 years at that time, and speaking with her neighbor who was a Ukrainian and came after World War II, so it was like 30 years. And my grandmother is speaking with lots of English in her speech, whereas the more recent immigrant was speaking pretty much purely Ukrainian. So, although these three social types of mixed languages have different social origins, they did have some things in common. I forgot to move the citation. That was our first draft of that paper that eventually got published later in the Festschrift for Mufwene. Contact between a state society and an indigenous small-scale society, a strong sense of heritage, that is the indigenous social identity, so the community whose linguistic identity would usually be lost through language shift. A very strong but not completely overwhelming social pressure from the state society, so enough to make the indigenous language get reduced, but not enough to completely eliminate it. And then a social identity that essentially adheres to the society from which the bulk of the basic vocabulary is replicated. So in other words, usually the indigenous society. So, again, these sort of pat descriptions like oh, the basic vocabulary is Cree, but the grammar is French. Really, you have to dig down into it and see, well, what parts of the vocabulary are indigenous, what parts are from the colonial language, and then you get a little more nuanced view of what's going on. So here's kind of the stable code mixing situation I mentioned. It's not very stable in the case of like my grandmother and her fellow Ukrainian immigrants to America, but this is different places like southwestern US. There are socially stable mixed codes, but may not be linguistically stable. So in the Southwest, they have names like Pocho and Calo to describe the sort of mixed code. That's what they call it, Spanish and English spoken in the borderlands. And it's like, it's not stable in the sense you could say, oh, this word is always the English word, and this other word is always the Spanish word in the mixture. So it's not stable in that conventional sense, but it's socially stable in that, you know, you constantly get renewal of people of the Spanish or English origin interacting and then leading to this code. And you find cases of Southwest US, Torres Strait in Australia between the local Pidgin English and the local indigenous language, Northwest Australia. So these languages have a name among the people. So Apneap for the Torres Strait one, Mikijamap, which is mix 'em up in the local Creole, the Creole with a K there, but it mixed up with Gorinji, with the local indigenous language. And then Russenorsk, one that's been discussed in the mixed language literature, where you've got a trade pidgin between Russians and Norwegians, and it's a mixture of the two. You can't say it, at least in terms of trade, neither society was so dominant that they imposed some version of their language as the trade pidgin. So the linguistic effects of reticulate neogeny, in other words, a new society created that involved the merging of societies that spoke different languages. And so, you know, they have the heritage language, the adoptive language, and then X to Y, X with the angle bracket to Y is the transition to X to Y. So so-called normal language maintenance. So you have the schematic linguemes, so those are things like construction schemas, lexical schemas, or polysemy schemas, and pronunciations. So grammatical morphemes, that is substance linguemes and basic vocabulary, non-basic, and they're, you know, the sort of what we think of as the most normal is when the heritage language has everything except maybe some non-basic vocabulary. Then in my situation I called death by borrowing, persistence in the face of social pressure. You get transitions, but the basic vocabulary is the most resistant to that. Functional turnover, this is where it's almost lost. And again, the basic vocabulary, like in those secret languages, like the Paro-Romani I gave you, the only thing that's left that's from the heritage language, the Romani, is some basic vocabulary. And then you have this sort of negative active identity of a secret language, which is a rejection of that dominant adoptive society. And so they just, the secret languages that Matras documented, essentially they just pulled languages, they just pulled stuff from, you know, everything from Romani to Hebrew to other secret languages, you know, other, you know, exogenous languages, to use as basic vocabulary in order to make themselves, you know, make their language secret, not understood by the wider population. And then, so these are all cases of positive active identity towards the heritage language. So active identity is an important concept in sociolinguistics, of course, and here is the identification with the heritage language and is resisting the dominant language. This next set is a positive active identity to the adoptive language. So you're kind of heading in that direction, but maybe not there all the way. Complete shift, you speak the adoptive language. Maybe there'll be some trace of constructions like in Irish English that are from the heritage language. Semi-shift, as I said, the only case that was clearly well documented was Media Lengua in Ecuador, where you've actually adopted the basic vocabulary and non-basic vocabulary of the language, but you've kept the grammatical morphemes and some schematic linguemes. Then you have the sort of incomplete creolization, where you have, to the extent that the grammatical morphemes don't disappear through simplification, even they will be a part of the adoptive language. Basic vocabulary adoptive. Maybe there'll be a mixture of sources for non-basic vocabulary. Then the mixed marriage languages is the case where they really seem to be mixed together. I mean, this is the case of as far as I could tell, seem to be the most symmetric contributions from two parent languages in language mixture. So to summarize, as I said at the beginning, incomplete communicative isolation is the norm in most speech communities. The widespread consequences, the widespread crossing of lineages across languages. So you have this what we call borrowing or merger. And a lot of people worry about this, like for instance, this well-known book by Thomason and Kaufman that discusses a lot of these mixed languages. They complicate phylogenetic analysis. What language is the parent of Haitian Creole? What language is the parent of Mishif or Miedni Aleut? What language is the parent of, Para-Romani? The more interesting question of saying, instead of trying to say, oh, it has one parent, this is the real parent, is what types of social structure interaction leads to the transfer of what types of linguemes? And that's where I think we can make some generalizations. They're hard, especially with the more symmetric contributions, but you can get some idea of, well, what are going to be the lineages of the different types of linguemes in the language if they don't all seem to come from one source. And of course, I think we way overestimate how often they come from just one source, even for the language spoken by all of us in this room. So this is a virtually unexplored aspect of language, and it's really sad because, of course, societies are changing rapidly, even faster than the languages are dying out. So there are many parts of the world where languages, we call them endangered, and there's still a substantial number of members of the speech community that use that language in everyday interactions within the communities. But already, like in, even in some of the languages of native North America where it's still pretty vital, the societies have changed so much because of the impact of the social changes since the European colonization of North America that it's hard to judge. We can't really measure what were the interactions like before the Europeans came. And we may not even have that much historical documentation of what the social changes were that happened after the Europeans came. I mean, for instance, in research in North America, there are hugely varying estimates of the population sizes of the different indigenous societies in North America. Very high to very low. We know they all dropped dramatically. But there's not like great censuses of the pueblos from the 17th century, for instance, in my own backyard. So it's very hard to figure out how those changes happened and which ones might have caused the kind of linguistic changes in those languages. I think that's the end of the line. Yes. Thank you. Sure.
Do you want to use the microphone?
Oh, okay.
Si ascoltano voi da casa.
Okay, so thank you for the lesson. And I have a question. Well, it's a kind of observation about your, or your observations about the phylogenetics, biological phylogenetics, and the idea that we can look at biological phylogenetics in order to try to understand something more about how languages also stems and diverge. But the fact is that maybe biological cladistics in this case.
Right.
Maybe it's not the best way to try to, I mean, it's not the best way to understand this kind of mixing between languages, because every language can mix between any other language, which is something that can't happen in cladistics. You can have this kind of mixing, but it is very unlikely. It can happen sometimes where every language can mate with every other language. Mm-hmm. And that's so maybe it's not like it's something which is more rare in unlikely in biology, while in languages it is virtually possible with every language.
Yes, well, I mean, I have looked at this stuff because I was interested in this for a while, and particularly when I spent a fair amount of time at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, which gave me an opportunity not just to talk to typologists, but also to biologists. And so, yeah, so the kind of tools, those computational tools that biologists use for phylogeny reconstruction, as they call building family trees, they make various assumptions about this, and the sort of standard tools force trees. In fact, it forces binary branching trees, which is why if you look at the more recent work, they see you always have either length of the diagram depicting where the branches are. So if they're really short, what that probably really means is that there were like 5 branches, but the algorithm forces it to a binary branching. And then they also have percentages, it's all these statistical techniques where they're actually, what you're looking at is a summary of like 10,000 trees, and then how many trees did this branching node occur in this set of 10,000, and it's given as a percentage. There was a period where they were looking at the network models, so these models that allowed reticulation, and they seemed to be like a fad for a while, but I guess they weren't quite as interesting. But then the more interesting thing, I think, for our point of view is that people are interested in the early history of humans. That's what the biologists at the Max Planck Institute were interested in, is, where did Homo sapiens, subspecies sapiens, us guys, come from? And then they discovered, well, we actually have a lot of Neanderthal genes in us. And then we even have some genes of Denisov man, a third species. Because the various human species were closely enough related that they really could, interbreed and have, fertile offspring that would then, also interbreed. So that's how come all of us, especially all of us with European ancestry, have a lot of Neanderthal genes in us. And I'm not as familiar, but they have techniques which they use to try to tease this apart, and it's, beyond just counting genes, looking to see because they're so closely related, they do hybridize, and they are interested in trying to figure that out. And I don't know if more recent work, which I haven't been following so much, actually captures or uses these techniques to try to, tease apart languages. Within linguistics, my point was those columns that are listed on this are a way of dividing up the linguemes of the language, categorizing the linguemes in the language that reflect, traditional historical linguistic categories like basic versus non-basic vocabulary, making a distinction that I think should be made between schematic linguemes and grammatical morphemes, the substance linguemes. You want to make those distinctions because we have reason to believe when you trace their lineages, they go in different paths. And so, and then also trying to find out what these social factors are. So we do have, some reasons to distinguish these, so that if you threw your linguistic cognate data into one of these phylogeny reconstruction programs, it's actually important whether we're dealing with a grammatical morpheme or basic vocabulary and non-basic vocabulary. And if we could get a profile of the language, then we might have some idea of, we can speculate, or we can do a little bit more than speculate. We can, form hypotheses about the social history of that speech community. And that to me is what's the interesting part. And so I don't know for that how much some of these, mathematical or computational algorithms can help us. Mauro. Want to give him the mic?
Thanks a lot. I would have many comments to any specific point you raised with specific examples from different parts of the world, and so, but I don't have the energy to do that. Yeah, in English, I mean, by the way.
Right, yes.
So
Yeah.
if I could speak Italian, it would be easy, but I can't.
Sorry.
No, that's why. I just say one single thing out of the many that I could say is about one factor that most linguists don't take into account, and I didn't take into account till some 20 years ago, when I started realizing how much changing mental representations of the world and human agency were so important for speakers that we as linguists and usually Western linguists, we observe at them and we try to take some examples or something from what they say, but behind that they have what they think. And so I realized that since many years ago, in the Amazon, but also among Afro-Brazilians in central Brazil, where I was studying the community of Cafundo and so on, that people in many places are absolutely aware of how much inadequate was their speech in relation to the mental representation, which was going much more ahead, in also as a consequence of contact. Mm-hmm. In contact was different kinds of contact. For instance, the presence of people from Western world or of missionaries and so on. So they keep feeling, I'm checking something like that also now in Fireland, in the southernmost language of the world that I'm studying now. This spot south of Chile and south of Argentina. They understand, because they are thinkers as we are, everybody thinks, and they are thinkers. Of course, not all of them in the same way, but some of them are thinkers, and they think about which is the representation of the world that they have, the one that their fathers or parents had, or their grandparents had. So they understand that it's changing. But the language, unfortunately for them, they understand that it's not adequate to represent all that. So at some point, they sort of give up and say, well, and that's also the reason that they were explaining to me many times through years. They didn't want to transmit their language to children or new generations. First, for the obvious reason that we all can understand of status, on having a job, of making money or whatever. But also the ability of talking about the world and human agency. This is a very important factor. And I could talk about a lot. If it was not in English, I could tell you a whole lot of examples about this. And so the feeling of inadequacy of language and the ability of talking about the world as it's represented by these newcomers who usually have been ourselves, I mean, Westerners or even worse, missionaries with new religions or whatever, they, in a sense, prefer to give up their language because it's it's not enough to talk about the new ways of talking or representing about the world. So there is a big issue that should be faced by linguists and with the support of anthropologists and also in some cases I could be even psychologists, because it's a very crucial way. And I could provide you examples of this, but now I don't have enough energy to do that. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that you don't, because I would be very interested to hear more about. I'm very sorry that because it would be very interesting to hear your perspective.
If we sit and have a coffee,
Yes, let's hope that will happen.
I can explain to you.
Yeah.
I mean, to talk to you about all this experience that they had along half a century.
Yes. No, I'm very aware of your experiences, that you've had these experiences.
This is a dimension that most linguists don't even take into account.
No, I agree with you there. And, it's, as I said, it's kind of sad that some linguists are starting to think about it. And yes, obviously I'm drawing a big and sketchy picture. And, part of what you come out of like looking at the mixed languages is, okay, there's very few examples, but every one of them is very different from the other. So we don't really have a full understanding of the full ranges of reasons why speakers of a speech community, behave linguistically in the way they do when they have available to them, linguims that are associated with different speech communities around them, including their own heritage one, their neighbors, their overlords, and different categories of people, like you say, missionaries versus linguists versus just traders or other people that they come into contact with. So it's all very important, and it's going to be very hard for us to understand this because there hasn't been that much documentation, the kind of things that you had in your experience.
What we usually understand as a linguistic fieldwork is just a joke. You have to be there for months, years, and you start understanding something about what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The way in which people understand themselves, what they have in their brain, and what their language allows them to communicate.
Yeah.
But you can't do that. They're going around putting some 20 questions or a sort of a standard linguistic fieldwork is not enough.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I have just a short comment. The approach that you are proposing is very close to me or to what I like. Actually, when I teach classes in social linguistics, usually I made the effort of trying, I want to say to deduce, but the condition in which the communication occurs trigger or favors or disfavors certain types of contacts. So in a way, the general goal of all of us should be to link the social condition of the language usage in the community and the effect of the contact. We probably are, as a historical linguist, are used to do this kind of work backward because we have a text and we often do not know which is the social environment in which the text was produced, and then we try to bring together various traces coming from different sources for producing what can be a kind of social history that can justify the kind of contact that we see in the text. This is especially frequent with inscriptions. For instance, in the early centuries of the Roman history, you find kind of mixing between Italic languages and Latin that would be completely strange in the later centuries. And they go with your framework, so to say. We usually are... So quite well known by Thomason and Kaufman, had a lot of impact on Italian historical social linguistics, because we do not have these probably so extreme cases of contact, but the idea of different levels of contact, different intensity of a contact. You can borrow basic vocabulary, then non-basic, then grammatical morphemes, then schematic linguims, and not exactly in a progression, but this is a very useful research idea, or at least I found it with a PhD of mine, we applied it to the Gospels and kind to infer the Semitic competence of the Greek-speaking people who wrote the Gospels. And I mean, in Italy, there is a lot of tradition for doing so with Armenian, which has almost a large part of the vocabulary, basic and non-basic, which is derived from the Iranian languages. And I found it also very useful on the Syriac languages. You have a lot of Syriac documents which are written by Greek speakers or by Iranian speakers. And from text to text, I don't know if it's really possible, but you seem to feel the mother tongue of the speakers interpreting the kind of mistakes. For instance, if you have texts in which you switch endings, you use Greek endings on Syriac words or Iranian ending on Syriac words, that's kind of a proof that probably the person who was writing the text had some kind of competence in these languages, or better, they were probably their first tongues. So all the approach that you showed us, it's very fascinating to me, and I found it very useful. So my only my question is determinism. Working on that, I mean, having this kind of habit of working backwards from the text to the social history. Now, from time to time, we are forced to make hypotheses on the social level. How can we transfer from a plan to another as if there were one-to-one mapping, or how much should we leave to the fact that social is, I mean, speech communities, social world is an open environment. So, I mean, I would like to be more deterministic. I cannot. That's my feeling when I work on this kind of subjects.
Well, this is the problem, because you remember I talked about yesterday about how language is just one piece of this social interactional context, and to understand what's going on in that language, you really have to understand that larger context. But we as linguists don't normally do that, and it's the problem of just volume of so much knowledge in so little time. Learning enough about sociology, social anthropology. And then even that, we're constrained to European scholarship. So like Mauro was saying, European scholars may not have such great insights as to what, native peoples in the Southwest or in Patagonia, other parts of the world, the true diversity, social diversity. I mean, most of us, linguists like me who become typologists, it's like we're fascinated by the diversity of the languages of the world, and what we're thinking of is the diversity of the grammatical structure, the lexicon. If anything, we're looking at maybe diversity of language, semantics and conceptualization across the world's languages. And we aren't even getting into the social stuff, and so much of the sociolinguistic standard sociolinguistics work and linguistics is done on Western European communities, often urban communities, and there's not much of a sort of variationist perspective on communities in other parts of the world speaking indigenous languages. And then maybe we should be rethinking paradigms. I mean, certainly there's some of that going on, but as I said, it's like too little, and now it's getting to be too late. And understanding how the range of social diversity there was before European expansion and colonization, and both settler colonialism and trade colonialism, and how that's impacted it. And I mentioned the research that shows that a lot of communities, even before they came into face-to-face contact with Europeans had already influenced or affected the way their lives were. Everything from diseases to restructuring of trade networks and to reorganizations of politics, the political, social scene. So it's like, and then the other thing I should mention too on lines of this is that one of your comments mentioned about looking at these texts and trying to figure out, is this a Iranian or a Greek speaker writing in Syriac? Is one of the things about taking this usage-based view is any language use is real language. You know, it's not bad Syriac. It's the way they wrote, the way they spoke maybe too. And we should be understanding how it is they spoke that way instead of, you know, aiming for some kind of purist view of normal language transmission, quote unquote, you know, native, you know, and so, you know, we're missing out on a lot of what goes on with language use if we do that or just focus on some kind of purist view of, say, your text and the philological work that you do. Another question here.
If I may just add something to what you've just said, during the last years, last centuries in which Celtic languages were still spoken on the European continent, then they were erased by Latin, you can find many inscriptions in which you have some mixed word between Gaulish and Latin, and you don't understand what's going on. And I believe that you're right. It is wrong to think, was this person a Celtic speaker who had some Latin influence because it was the prestige language? I believe he simply spoke what he spoke. He believed that he was speaking a language. Maybe he called it Gaulish, maybe he called it Latin, but the interesting thing to me is that he spoke that way. And so I believe these yield very interesting insights in terms of how languages interact, and we are also close to a language debt here, so it may give us many information about many things. Thank you.
Thanks.
So thank you very much, Bill, for your lesson, and
Thank you.
we'll see tomorrow here for those of you who are also attending online.
Yeah, and that's the earlier time.
Yeah, that's earlier. It's 11:30 tomorrow.
7:30, yeah.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.